My bank account was wiped clean. $50,000 vanished into thin air just days before my 35th birthday. When I demanded answers, my father scoffed that family comes first, while my mother smirked and told me I would survive. I did not scream or cry. I simply said nothing and walked out. That night, I made one quiet phone call. By morning, everything they relied on was gone, and the absolute destruction of their perfect suburban lives was only just beginning. I am Claire, 35 years old, and the founder of a highly successful boutique public relations firm in Chicago. For years, I had been the scapegoat of my family, while simultaneously serving as their secret financial safety net. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Please hit the like button and subscribe if you have ever had to sever ties with toxic relatives who confused your generosity with weakness. It was a crisp Tuesday morning when the illusion of our family dynamic finally shattered. I was standing in the sleek glass-walled office of an exclusive event planner downtown. The sunlight was streaming through the floor-to-ceiling windows, catching the gold accents on the mahogany desk. I was there to put down the deposit for my public relations firm annual corporate retreat. This was a proud moment for me. I had built my company from the ground up, working 80-hour weeks while my parents constantly belittled my career choices. Now I was booking a luxury resort in Sedona for my 20 dedicated employees. The event planner, a sharply dressed woman named Diane, smiled warmly as she ran my platinum business card through the terminal. We were chatting about the catering menu when the machine let out a sharp, obnoxious beep. Diane frowned, tapping the screen. She tried it again. Another loud beep echoed in the quiet room. "I am so sorry, Claire," she murmured, her cheeks flushing slightly. "It says the transaction is declined." I laughed, brushing it off as a simple bank error. I pulled out my phone and opened my banking application, expecting to see a routine fraud alert or a system glitch. Instead, the numbers on the screen made my blood run completely cold. The legacy joint account I used as a backup for my business operations was entirely drained. A wire transfer for exactly $50,000 had been executed at 8 in the morning. My heart slammed against my ribs as I clicked on the transaction details. The destination account belonged to my father, Richard. This was not a mistake. This was a deliberate, calculated theft. Years ago, when I first started my business, my father had guilted me into keeping this specific joint account open. He claimed it was for extreme family emergencies, a safety net just in case something catastrophic happened to my mother, Patricia, or my younger sister, Allison. "You never know when family might need you, Claire," he had said, puffing his chest out with patriarchal authority. "It is your duty to be prepared." I had agreed because despite their constant criticism, I still foolishly craved their approval. I had left a healthy cushion of $50,000 in that account and instructed my bank to link it to my business overdraft as a pure formality. I had not touched that money in 4 years. Neither had they. Until today. The office around me seemed to blur. Diane was asking if I wanted to try another card, but I could barely hear her. $50,000. It was not just the amount of money, though, that was a substantial sum. It was the absolute violation of trust. I realized instantly what this was about. My younger sister Allison was married to Dion, a man who masqueraded as a wealthy cryptocurrency entrepreneur on social media. In reality, Dion was a smooth-talking grifter constantly drowning in debt, and my parents worshipped the ground he walked on simply because he fit their aesthetic ideal of a successful son-in-law. They had undoubtedly taken my money to fund whatever new scam he was running. Most people would panic in this situation. They would cry or frantically call the bank to freeze the transfer or call the police to report fraud. But as I stood there in that sunlit office, I did not feel panic. I felt a deep, absolute, and terrifying clarity. The years of swallowing their insults, the holidays spent being told I worked too much because I was unlovable, the endless financial favors I did behind the scenes to keep their country club image intact, all of it crystallized into a singular point of focus. I looked up at Diane and smiled calmly. I apologize, Diane. I said, my voice completely steady. There seems to be a minor restructuring issue with one of my holding accounts. I will wire the deposit to you directly by the end of the day. I walked out of the office and stepped into the elevator. I pulled out my phone and canceled my afternoon meetings, every single one of them. I walked straight to the parking garage and got into my car. I did not call my father. I did not text my mother to ask why they had taken the money. There was no point in asking questions when I already knew the answers. I started the engine, the low rumble vibrating through the steering wheel. I pulled out of the garage and merged onto the highway, driving straight toward the affluent suburban neighborhood where my parents lived. They thought my money was an endless well they could draw from without consequence. They were about to learn exactly what happens when the well dries up. I parked my car in the wide circular driveway, pulling in right behind Dion and his pristine luxury SUV. It was a top-of-the-line model secretly leased under my corporate holding company because his credit score was completely wrecked. I walked up the manicured brick pathway of my parents' sprawling colonial estate. The perfectly trimmed hedges and the blooming hydrangeas felt like a mockery. This was the fortress of expectations I had always failed to conquer. I did not bother ringing the doorbell. I turned the heavy brass knob, pushed the solid oak door open, and stepped into the grand foyer. The house smelled like fresh lilies and expensive citrus wax. I could hear the faint sound of jazz music playing from the built-in speakers, and the bright, unmistakable sound of laughter drifting from the sunroom at the back of the house. It was the light, carefree laughter of people who had never been forced to face a single real consequence in their entire lives. I walked down the long hallway, my heels clicking sharply against the polished hardwood floors. I stepped into the doorway of the sunroom and stopped. The afternoon light was pouring through the massive skylights, illuminating a scene that made the blood pound in my ears. My father, Richard, was leaning back comfortably in a woven wicker chair, holding a crystal flute of vintage champagne. My mother, Patricia, was sitting on the floral sofa, her legs crossed elegantly as she casually flipped through a thick designer catalog. Across from them, my younger sister, Allison, was curled up happily next to her husband, Dion. Dion was wearing a ridiculously expensive gold watch that I knew for a fact he could not afford. They were all smiling. They were all celebrating. They were toasting with the money they had just stolen from me. The laughter abruptly stopped the moment they noticed me standing in the doorway. Allison lowered her crystal glass, her perfectly manicured eyebrows pulling together in a defensive frown. "What are you doing here, Claire?" my mother asked without looking up from her catalog. "You usually never leave your office before 7. Did you spill coffee on your blouse again?" I ignored her passive-aggressive greeting. I walked straight over to the heavy glass coffee table in the center of the room. I pulled my phone from my purse, unlocked the screen, and placed it face up right next to the silver ice bucket, chilling their second bottle of champagne. The banking application was still open, displaying the $50,000 wire transfer in glaring red numbers. I looked directly at my father. "I want an explanation," I said, my voice perfectly level and quiet. "And I want it right now." Richard sighed, leaning forward to glance at the glowing screen. He did not look guilty. He did not look caught. If anything, he looked profoundly annoyed that I was interrupting his pleasant afternoon. He reached for the champagne bottle and calmly topped off his glass. "Do not be dramatic, Claire," he scoffed, taking a slow, deliberate sip. "Dayon has a new tech startup, and they needed bridge funding immediately to secure their developer team. You make that much money in a single month at your agency. Family comes first. You know that." I stared at him, letting the sheer audacity of his words hang in the air. Bridge funding. He was treating my emergency savings account like a petty cash drawer. I had worked 80-hour weeks to build my public relations firm. I had sacrificed holidays, relationships, and my own peace of mind to secure my clients. And my father genuinely believed he had the right to simply drain $50,000 because my sister's husband wanted to play the role of a wealthy entrepreneur. "Did you even read a business plan?" I asked, looking between my father and Dion. Did you look at a single financial projection before you decided to wire my money to someone who does not even have a registered business license? Dion shifted uncomfortably on the sofa, but quickly plastered on his signature charismatic smile. Come on, Claire, he said, spreading his hands in a smooth, placating gesture. The market moves fast. If we did not lock in the capital today, we would have lost the opportunity to scale our operations. It is an investment in our collective future. Your future, I corrected him coldly. Not mine. You stole from me. That is when my mother decided to intervene. Patricia set her designer catalog down on the glass table and gave me a look of profound disappointment. She swirled the champagne in her glass, the bubbles catching the warm sunlight. Stop using such ugly words, Claire, she chimed in, her tone dripping with absolute condescension. Nobody stole anything from you. Your father is a joint owner on that old account. He has every legal right to transfer those funds to help his family. Honestly, you are making a massive scene over absolutely nothing. You are single, you work entirely too much, and you have zero expenses. What do you even need that much cash for right now anyway? I felt a muscle tick in my jaw, but I refused to give her the satisfaction of seeing me lose my temper. They wanted me to yell. They wanted me to become emotional so they could label me the crazy sister and invalidate my anger. I simply looked at her, absorbing the reality of her words. Allison leaned forward, resting her hand protectively on Dion's arm. She looked at me with an expression of pure synthetic pity. Mom is right, Claire, she said softly, playing the role of the innocent victim perfectly. You have your career, but Dion and I are trying to build a real foundation. We are building a legacy for our future children. You should be happy to help us. It is not like you have a family of your own to support. The cruelty of her words was deliberate and practiced. My family had always used my independence as a weapon against me, painting my success as a symptom of loneliness, rather than a result of relentless hard work. They justified their parasitism by telling themselves they were doing me a favor by allowing me to contribute to their picture-perfect lives. I was the difficult child, but my checkbook was always welcome to sit at the table. I looked at the four of them sitting in that beautiful sunroom, surrounded by the luxury that I secretly subsidized. For years, I had swallowed my pride to keep the peace. I had paid their hidden debts, covered their extravagant country club fees, and bailed out Allison's endless string of failed boutique businesses. I had done it all hoping that one day they would look at me with the same pride and affection they showered on her. But standing there looking at the empty champagne bottle and the smug, entitled expressions on their faces, I finally understood the brutal truth. There was no amount of money I could ever give them that would buy their respect. To them, I was not a daughter and I was not a sister. I was an appliance, a financial utility designed to be used and discarded whenever it suited their needs. My silence seemed to embolden my father. Richard set his glass down on the table with a sharp clink and pointed a stern finger at me. I do not want to hear another word about this, he said, his voice taking on that familiar, authoritative tone he always used to shut down any argument. The money is gone, and it is being put to good use. You should be proud that your brother-in-law is taking initiative instead of throwing a tantrum. He leaned back in his wicker chair, crossing his arms over his chest. Now put your phone away, sit down and have a glass of champagne. Or if you are just going to stand there and pout, you can turn around and leave. We are celebrating, and I will not have you ruining the atmosphere with your petty jealousy. I stood perfectly still in the center of the sunroom, absorbing my father's ultimatum. Sit down and accept the theft or leave. Before I could respond, Dion uncrossed his legs and stood up, smoothing the front of his designer trousers. He adopted a pose that he probably thought made him look like a visionary Silicon Valley mogul. He shoved one hand into his pocket and offered me a condescending smile that did not quite reach his eyes. Look, Claire, Dion began, his voice dripping with faux sympathy. I get it. You are a traditional business owner. Public relations is a solid little industry, but it is outdated. Tech is the future. My application is going to completely disrupt the current market paradigm. We are talking about utilizing cutting-edge algorithms and blockchain synergy to revolutionize digital networking. You just do not see the larger vision because you are stuck in the daily grind. I stared at him. He was using a salad of buzzwords that meant absolutely nothing to justify stealing $50,000 from my bank account. But because I am a generous guy and because we are family, Dayon continued, taking a step closer. I have decided to do something nice for you. Consider it an early birthday present. I am going to draft a contract giving you a full 1% equity stake in the company. When we go public, that 1% will be worth 10 times what we borrowed today. You are getting in on the ground floor, Claire. You should be thanking me. A 1% equity stake in a company that did not exist outside of his delusional mind. He was offering me a microscopic fraction of my own stolen money and framing it as a generous gift. Allison sighed loudly, sinking deeper into the floral sofa. She picked up her crystal flute and pointed it at me. Seriously, Claire, can you just stop ruining the vibe for once? She whined. We were having a perfectly lovely afternoon until you stormed in here with your toxic energy. You are always so negative. This is exactly why you cannot keep a man. You are too rigid, and you refuse to support the people around you. Just say thank you to Dayon and let it go. In the past, this was the exact moment the script would play out the way they wanted it to. I knew the choreography of this dysfunctional dance by heart. Usually, this is where the sheer weight of their gaslighting would break me. I would start to cry out of sheer frustration. I would raise my voice to defend myself, desperately trying to make them understand my perspective. And the moment I raised my voice, my father would yell at me for being hysterical. My mother would act terrified of my anger. They would brand me as the unstable, aggressive black sheep of the family, and use my emotional reaction to completely invalidate my entirely justified outrage. Eventually exhausted and broken, I would apologize just to stop the fighting. I would retreat to my car and cry all the way home while they finished their champagne in peace. But today, something inside my chest simply stopped beating to their rhythm. The desperate, lonely child inside of me, who had spent 35 years begging for their approval, finally died. And in her place, a cold, calculating professional took the wheel. I looked at my mother, who was already flipping back to her designer catalog. I looked at my father, who was watching me with a smug, challenging glare, daring me to throw a tantrum. I looked at my sister, who was resting her head on the shoulder of a grifter. And finally, I looked at Dayon, who was still wearing that insufferable, arrogant smile. They did not see a successful woman standing in front of them. They saw a bank, an automatic teller machine that they could kick whenever they wanted a payout. They felt entirely safe disrespecting me because they genuinely believed I would never cut them off. They thought my craving for their love was a chain that would bind me to them forever. They were wrong. I did not yell. I did not shed a single tear. I did not try to explain to Dayon that his fake equity offer was an insult to my intelligence. I did not try to convince my father that stealing was wrong. You cannot negotiate with parasites, and you certainly do not cry over them. I calmly reached across the heavy glass coffee table and picked up my phone. I slid it into my purse and snapped the gold clasp shut. The sharp, metallic click echoed loudly in the quiet sunroom. The total absence of my usual emotional breakdown seemed to unnerve them slightly. My father lowered his glass, his thick gray eyebrows furrowing in confusion. Allison stopped swirling her champagne. They were waiting for the explosion, but I refused to give them the match. Enjoy the champagne, I said, my voice quiet, smooth, and completely void of any emotion. I turned around and walked out of the sunroom. I did not look back when my mother called my name, with a sudden sharp edge of uncertainty in her voice. I walked down the long hardwood hallway, my footsteps echoing off the high ceilings. I stepped out the heavy oak front door and pulled it shut behind me, listening to the solid, satisfying thud of the latch engaging. The afternoon air hit my face, and for the first time in my entire life, I felt like I could actually breathe. I walked down the brick pathway, past Dion's leased luxury sport utility vehicle, and got into my own car. I shut the door, sealing out the affluent neighborhood and the toxic family that lived inside it. I gripped the leather steering wheel. They thought they had won because they got away with $50,000. They had no idea that I held the keys to their entire financial existence. The preamble was over. The real game had just begun. I sat in the driver's seat of my car, the engine idling quietly beneath me. The air conditioning hummed, blowing cool air against my face, but I barely felt it. Through the tinted windshield, I stared at the sprawling colonial house. The perfectly manicured lawn, the pristine brick exterior, the expensive luxury vehicles parked in the driveway. It all looked like a picture of generational wealth and unshakable stability, a fortress of upper-class American success. But as I reached over to the passenger seat and unzipped my leather work tote, I knew the absolute truth. The entire fortress was built on a foundation of sand, and I was the only thing holding the walls up. I pulled out my laptop, resting it against the steering wheel, and flipped the screen open. I connected to my mobile hotspot and opened my secure web browser. My fingers flew across the keyboard, typing in the web address for my master financial management portal. The screen glowed, illuminating the quiet interior of my car as the two-factor authentication prompt appeared. I pressed my thumb against the biometric scanner. The system chimed softly, and my entire financial portfolio loaded onto the screen. For the past 5 years, I had been living a double life. To my family, I was the quiet, workaholic sister, the one who never quite fit into their glamorous social circles. But in reality, I was the sole financial guarantor for their entire extravagant lifestyle. This was my ultimate weapon, my absolute leverage, and until this exact moment, I had never even considered using it. It started small, half a decade ago. My father, Richard, had come to my apartment late one night looking pale and unusually humble. He confessed that his traditional investments had taken a massive hit, and he needed a temporary guarantor to secure a bridge loan to keep his business afloat. He swore it would only be for 6 months. He promised it was just a technicality. I was young. My public relations firm was just starting to turn a massive profit, and I was completely desperate for his approval. I signed the paperwork. But the 6 months turned into a year, and the single loan morphed into a complex web of financial dependency. Once they realized my credit was flawless and my corporate holding company had massive backing, they started using me as their personal safety net. And because I wanted to buy their love, I let them. I clicked on the first tab in my portfolio, labeled Liabilities and Dependents. A long, meticulously organized list of accounts appeared on the screen. I scrolled down to the credit card section. There it was. My mother, Patricia's Platinum credit card. The same card she used to buy her designer clothes, pay for her expensive salon treatments, and maintain her pristine country club appearance. She loved to flaunt that metal card in front of her wealthy friends, pretending she was the matriarch of a thriving financial dynasty. She had conveniently forgotten that her account was merely a secondary authorized user line attached directly to my corporate credit profile. Every single time she swiped that card to buy a $300 facial or a bottle of vintage champagne, my company paid the bill. I clicked the next tab, moving from credit accounts to commercial real estate. A digital copy of a massive commercial lease agreement loaded onto the screen. This was Allison's pride and joy. Her chic aesthetic lifestyle boutique located in one of the most expensive shopping districts downtown. She constantly posted on social media about being a self-made female entrepreneur. She loved giving interviews to local lifestyle blogs about the struggles of building a brand from scratch. But the lease agreement on my screen told the real story. 3 years ago, when Allison tried to rent that prime retail space, the property management company ran her credit and laughed her out of the building. She had zero collateral and a history of defaulted loans. She had come to me crying, begging me to co-sign the lease so she could achieve her dream. Against my better judgment, I had my corporate lawyer structure a deal. My holding company was the absolute guarantor of her commercial lease. If she missed a payment, my company covered it. More importantly, if I formally withdrew my guarantor status as the financial backer, the property management company had the legal right to terminate her lease and padlock the doors within 24 hours. They genuinely thought my money was a well that would never run dry. They believed they were entitled to my hard work because I was blood. They had spent years carefully cultivating this dynamic, where they could mock me to my face while quietly siphoning my resources behind my back. My mother criticizing my outfits while wearing a cashmere sweater I paid for. My father calling my career a little public relations project while using my credit score to keep his golf club membership active. My sister telling me I was toxic while standing inside a boutique that only existed because I signed my name on the dotted line. And then there was Dion, the smooth-talking grifter who had the absolute audacity to offer me a 1% equity stake in a fake tech startup using $50,000 he had just stolen from my emergency fund. They had crossed the final boundary. They had moved from quiet parasitism to outright blatant theft. I sat there in the quiet sanctuary of my car, watching the cursor blink on the bright screen. I thought about the $50,000. In the grand scheme of my business, it was a sum I could easily recover. But it was not about the money anymore. It was about the utter lack of respect. It was about the arrogant smirk on Allison's face when she told me to stop ruining the vibe. It was about the cold dismissal in my father's eyes when he told me to sit down and accept it. They had fundamentally misunderstood the power dynamic in our relationship. They thought my silence was weakness. They thought my willingness to pay their bills was a symptom of pathetic desperation. They did not realize that the hand that feeds you is also the hand that can choke you. I rested my hands on the steering wheel, looking one last time at the beautiful colonial house. The sun was beginning to set, casting long, dark shadows across the perfectly trimmed lawn. Inside that house, they were probably pouring a third bottle of champagne, laughing at how easily they had put me in my place. They thought they had won. They thought they had successfully disciplined the black sheep of the family. I leaned back against the leather headrest, a slow, cold smile spreading across my face. I whispered quietly to the empty car. They wanted to take my money without asking. Fine. Let us see exactly how they survive without it. I reached for my phone resting in the center console. I opened my contacts list and scrolled past my parents and my sister. I did not need to speak to them ever again. The time for arguing was over. The time for action had arrived. I had 3 phone calls to make before the banks closed for the evening. 3 quiet, meticulous phone calls that would systematically dismantle their entire reality by sunrise. I tapped the first name on my list and lifted the phone to my ear, listening to the line begin to ring. I tapped the first name on my priority list and lifted the phone to my ear. I was calling David, my senior wealth manager at the private banking firm I used for my corporate accounts. The phone rang twice before he answered, his voice smooth and professional. He sounded slightly surprised to hear from me on a Tuesday evening well outside of our usual quarterly review schedule. I did not waste any time with pleasantries. I told him to pull up my master portfolio and navigate to the secondary authorized user accounts. I could hear the rapid clicking of his keyboard through the speaker. "David," I said, keeping my voice perfectly level. "I need you to initiate an immediate and total financial freeze on all secondary credit lines and supplementary cards attached to my primary corporate profile." There was a brief pause on the other end of the line. David was a seasoned professional who handled high-net-worth individuals, but even he sounded momentarily caught off guard by the sudden request. "Claire," he began cautiously, "just to be absolutely clear, you are asking me to freeze the platinum card currently held by your mother Patricia, as well as the revolving business credit line guaranteed for your father Richard. If I execute this freeze right now, those cards will decline immediately the next time they are swiped. Any recurring auto drafts attached to those accounts will also fail." "That is exactly what I want," I replied, staring through the windshield at the brightly lit windows of my parents' house. "I want the accounts frozen immediately, and I want all guarantor ties severed permanently. Remove my holding company as the financial backer for my father's business loans. Send the formal withdrawal notification to his lenders first thing in the morning. David did not ask any questions. In his line of work, he had likely seen countless family financial disputes. He simply confirmed my instructions and told me he was executing the freeze. I listened to the steady sound of his typing, knowing that with every keystroke, my mother's pristine country club lifestyle was being systematically dismantled. There would be no more $300 spa treatments charged to my company. There would be no more vintage wine purchased to impress her wealthy friends on my dime. My father's ability to leverage my immaculate credit score to float his own failing investments was officially terminated. "It is done, Claire," David said, his tone purely business. "The cards are deactivated. The withdrawal of guarantor status has been filed and will hit their lenders' systems when the banks open tomorrow. They have absolutely zero access to your funds." I thanked him and ended the call. The first pillar of their fake wealth was gone. I did not hesitate before dialing the second number. I called Gregory, my corporate attorney. Gregory was an absolute shark of a lawyer who handled all the aggressive negotiations and legal structuring for my public relations agency. He picked up on the first ring. "Gregory, I need you to pull the commercial real estate files for my holding company," I said. "Specifically, I need you to look at the commercial lease agreement we guaranteed for Allison's lifestyle boutique downtown." I waited a few moments while Gregory accessed the secure digital vault. I could picture him sitting in his high-rise office reviewing the complex legal jargon we had used to secure that prime retail space for my sister. When Allison had begged me to back her business 3 years ago, Gregory had strongly advised against it. He had warned me that her business plan was non-existent, and her financial history was a disaster. I had ignored his advice because I was still desperately trying to buy my sister's affection. Now I was finally ready to let Gregory do his job. "I have the lease right here, Claire," he said. "What is the issue?" "I am officially withdrawing my holding company as the financial guarantor for the property," I told him. "I want you to draft the formal termination paperwork immediately." Gregory let out a low whistle. "You understand the mechanics of this contract, Claire. The property management group only agreed to lease her that space because your company is backing it. The moment we submit this withdrawal notice, she will be in direct violation of her lease terms. The management company will be legally obligated to issue a default notice. They will likely send someone to padlock the doors and change the locks by tomorrow morning to protect their assets." I smiled a cold, hard smile in the darkness of my car. Allison loved playing the role of the self-made female entrepreneur. She loved giving interviews to local lifestyle blogs about how hard she worked to build her brand while secretly relying on my money to pay her exorbitant rent. She had told me I was toxic. She had told me I was ruining the vibe. I wanted to see how well she maintained her aesthetic vibe when she was standing on the sidewalk staring at a legally padlocked door. "Draft the termination paperwork," Gregory I instructed. "I want it hand-delivered to the property manager by a courier before the end of the business day today. Make sure they understand that my company is completely removing itself from all liability regarding that retail space. Let Allison figure out how to pay her own rent." "Consider it done," Gregory said, a hint of professional satisfaction in his voice. "I will send you the confirmation receipt once the courier delivers the notice." I hung up the phone. 2 calls down. The structural foundation of their entire existence was now completely gone. The financial umbilical cord had been cut, and they were entirely on their own. But I was not finished. Stopping them from using my money in the future was only half the battle. I still needed to deal with the $50,000 Dion had stolen from me this morning. I needed the ammunition for the final blow. I dialed the third and final number. I called Thomas. Thomas was a private investigator I kept on a heavy retainer for my crisis management firm. He was the man I called when a high-profile client was dealing with a blackmail attempt, or when a corporate executive needed a scandal quietly swept under the rug. He was brilliant, relentless, and absolutely ruthless when it came to uncovering hidden truths. Thomas answered with a simple, low greeting. I got straight to the point. "I have a job for you, Thomas, and I need it prioritized over everything else," I said. I am sending you the full legal name and social security number of a man named Dion. He is my brother-in-law. I have his information on file from a background check I ran years ago. This morning, a wire transfer for $50,000 was routed from my joint bank account to an account he controls. He claims it was bridge funding for a new tech startup. Thomas asked, his voice completely flat. That is his story, I replied. He used a lot of buzzwords about blockchain and algorithms, but it sounded like a rehearsed script. I do not believe a single word of it. I need you to track exactly where that money went in the last 12 hours. I want to know the final destination of every single penny. I want to know who really controls the account it landed in, and I want to know exactly what kind of trouble he is trying to buy his way out of. Thomas let out a dry, raspy laugh. A guy like that suddenly needing $50,000 in cash is never investing in software, Claire. That kind of money moving that fast usually points to gambling debts, offshore accounts, or paying off a very aggressive creditor. Give me his details. I will pull his entire digital footprint and trace the routing numbers. How quickly can you get me the information I asked? Give me 12 hours, Thomas replied confidently. I will have a complete financial dossier in your encrypted inbox before you finish your morning coffee. I thanked him and ended the call. I set my phone down on the passenger seat and took a deep, slow breath. The sun had completely set now. The sky was pitch black and the air was growing cold. I looked out the window at the beautiful colonial house one last time. The large windows glowed warmly against the dark sky, looking like a perfect glowing jewel box. Inside, my parents and my sister were still drinking champagne, still celebrating their clever little theft. They felt entirely untouchable. They had absolutely no idea that while they were toasting to their fake success, I was sitting right outside in their driveway, quietly dismantling their entire reality. I shifted my car into drive and pulled out of the neighborhood, heading back toward the city skyline in the distance. I felt a strange sense of absolute peace settling over my shoulders. Tomorrow was my 35th birthday, and watching their house of cards completely collapse was going to be the greatest gift I had ever received. The morning of my 35th birthday began with a profound and beautiful silence. I woke up in my downtown penthouse apartment, the early sunlight reflecting off the waters of Lake Michigan. I did not set an alarm. For the first time in years, I did not wake up with a knot of anxiety in my stomach about what family crisis I would have to manage today. I walked into my kitchen, barefoot ground some premium coffee beans, and pressed start on the espresso machine. At exactly 8:15, the silence was broken. My phone, which was resting on the marble kitchen island, vibrated. Then it vibrated again, and again. Within 60 seconds, the device was buzzing so continuously, it was slowly inching its way across the countertop. I picked up my coffee mug, took a slow, satisfying sip, and walked over to the screen. The dominoes were falling right on schedule. I looked at the lock screen. I had 14 unread text messages and 3 missed calls, all from my mother, Patricia. I unlocked the phone and opened her message thread. The progression of her texts was a masterpiece of escalating panic. The first text arrived at 8 in the morning. It read simply, "Call your bank right now. There is some sort of ridiculous glitch." The second text arrived 10 minutes later. "Claire, answer your phone. I am sitting in the chair at the country club salon, and my platinum card just declined. Diane is staring at me. Fix this immediately." By 8:15, her messages had devolved into pure, frantic humiliation. "I am trapped at the front desk. The manager had to come out and try the card manually. It is completely dead. Everyone in the lobby is looking at me. They are treating me like some sort of beggar. Why are you doing this? You are ruining my reputation." I smiled, taking another sip of my coffee. I could picture the scene perfectly. My mother sitting in the plush velvet chair of the exclusive salon, her hair still wrapped in expensive conditioning foils, her face burning bright red. She had spent decades building an image of untouchable upper-class wealth, treating the salon staff like her personal servants. and now she was standing at the register unable to pay for her $300 blowout in front of the exact wealthy friends she constantly tried to impress. The social death she was experiencing in that lobby was the ultimate poetic justice. Before I could even process the full satisfaction of my mother's public humiliation, my phone vibrated with a new string of texts. This time, they were from my father, Richard. Unlike my mother, Richard did not panic. He commanded. His texts were typed in short, aggressive bursts of patriarchal authority. Call me the second you wake up. My auto draft for the golf club membership just bounced. The billing department just called my cell phone. I just tried to log into the corporate credit portal, and my access is revoked. What kind of stunt are you pulling, Claire? Restore my guarantor status right now. You do not disrespect your father like this. Family comes first. Fix it. I let out a soft laugh. Family comes first. It was the same hollow phrase he had used yesterday when he justified stealing $50,000 from me. He was perfectly fine with family coming first when it meant raiding my bank account, but the moment his own comfort was threatened, he was completely unhinged. The bank had processed my withdrawal of guarantor status right at the start of the business day. The bridge loans he had secured using my holding company were instantly flagged. He was waking up to the brutal reality that he was not a successful businessman. He was a financial parasite who had just killed his only host. Then the phone screen changed completely. An incoming call took over the display. It was Allison. I did not answer it. I let it ring, watching her smiling contact photo flash on the screen until it finally rolled over to voicemail. A minute later, an audio message popped into my inbox. I tapped play and put the phone on speaker, setting it down on the marble counter. Allison's voice filled my kitchen, and she was absolutely hysterical. She was not just crying, she was hyperventilating. "Claire, you have to call me back," she sobbed, her voice echoing as if she was standing in an empty hallway. "You have to call Gregory right now and tell him this is a huge mistake. The property manager just showed up at the boutique with a locksmith. They are changing the locks. They handed me an eviction notice and told me I have to vacate the premises immediately because you pulled your financial backing." I heard the sound of a heavy metal door slamming shut in the background of the audio message. My employees are standing on the sidewalk. "Claire," she screamed, her aesthetic vibe entirely shattered. "People are walking by and staring at us. They are putting a padlock on my front door. You cannot do this to me. This is my business. This is my legacy. Answer the phone." The voicemail clicked off, leaving the kitchen quiet once again. I looked at the screen. 47 missed calls in the span of 30 minutes. A symphony of panic from 3 people who had spent my entire life making me feel small. They had woken up thinking they had put me in my place. Instead, they woke up entirely bankrupt, evicted, and publicly humiliated. They were experiencing the exact consequences of their own arrogance. I did not feel a single ounce of guilt. I felt completely liberated. I ignored the 47 missed calls and swiped away the notifications. I walked over to my dining table and opened my laptop. I had completely dismantled my family by simply removing my money from their lives, but I still had one loose thread to tie up. Dion. I needed to know exactly why he was desperate enough to steal $50,000 in cash. I opened my encrypted email inbox. Right at the top of the list was a message sent just 5 minutes ago. The sender was Thomas, my private investigator. The subject line read simply, "Dion's Financials." I sat down in my chair, resting my coffee mug on a coaster, and clicked the email. Thomas was incredibly thorough. He had attached a comprehensive 15-page digital dossier detailing every single movement Dion had made over the last 48 hours. I bypassed the summary and scrolled straight to the transaction tracking section. Thomas had traced the wire transfer my father had initiated from my joint account. The money had not gone to a developer team. It had not gone to secure a software patent. In fact, the money had not stayed in the United States for more than 20 minutes. The $50,000 had been routed into a shell account under Dion's name and then immediately wired to an offshore banking institution located in the Cayman Islands. But Thomas did not stop there. He had pulled the receiving account's details. The offshore account belonged to an illicit sports betting syndicate, known for catering to high-rolling clients who wanted to hide their gambling debts from the federal government. Dion was not a tech visionary. He was a degenerate gambler. I kept reading, my eyes scanning the crisp black text on the bright screen. According to the financial footprint Thomas had uncovered, Dion had been hemorrhaging money for the last 2 years. He had taken out massive predatory loans using his fake tech startup as collateral. But the startup was entirely fictitious. Thomas had attached copies of federal court filings. The Securities and Exchange Commission, alongside the federal authorities, had been quietly investigating Dion's business for wire fraud for the last 6 months. The picture became crystal clear. Dion owed a massive amount of money to very dangerous people. The offshore bookies had likely threatened him, demanding immediate payment. Desperate and out of options, he had convinced my gullible father to steal from my emergency account, framing it as a once-in-a-lifetime bridge funding opportunity. Dion took the money, paid off his illegal gambling debt, and handed me a fake equity contract to cover his tracks. He thought he was a genius. He thought he had outsmarted the quiet sister-in-law. He thought his secrets were perfectly safe. I leaned back in my chair, reading the final sentence of Thomas' report. The federal authorities are preparing to unseal the indictment against Dion for wire fraud within the next month. I closed the laptop, a slow, genuine smile spreading across my face. My family thought I was going to spend my birthday crying over their cruelty. They had no idea that they had just handed me the very weapon I needed to destroy the last remaining pillar of their toxic dynamic. The financial freeze was the punishment for their disrespect. But the dossier sitting on my hard drive was going to be the absolute execution of their entire social standing. The pieces were perfectly set on the board. All I had to do now was wait for the perfect moment to play my final card. I looked at the calendar hanging on the wall. Thanksgiving was exactly 2 weeks away. Patricia always hosted a massive formal dinner inviting the entire extended family and half the affluent neighborhood to show off her perfect life. It would be the absolute perfect stage for a grand finale. I was in the middle of reviewing a press release for a major corporate client when my office phone buzzed. It was my executive assistant, Megan, and her voice was trembling. She apologized for interrupting my deep work, but told me there was an escalating situation in the main reception area. She said my family had bypassed the downstairs security desk and was currently refusing to leave. I stood up, smoothing the front of my tailored skirt, and walked out of my private office. I stepped over to the glass balcony that overlooked our expansive 2-story lobby to see the chaos for myself. The scene unfolding below was a masterclass in toxic manipulation. My public relations firm represented some of the most high-profile executives and public figures in Chicago. The reception space was designed to project absolute calm and absolute power. It was currently occupied by 3 important clients waiting for their morning meetings. My family did not care about my professional reputation. They were on a mission to publicly break me, and they were willing to burn my agency to the ground to do it. Patricia was in rare form, putting on the theatrical performance of a lifetime. She was standing in the center of the lobby, weeping loudly, and clutching her expensive designer handbag to her chest. She was not just crying, she was broadcasting her grief to the entire room. She looked directly at a bewildered delivery driver and wailed that I was an unnatural, cruel daughter. She cried that I had abandoned my own flesh and blood in their darkest hour, and that city money had turned me into a heartless monster. It was the exact manipulative tactic that had always worked when I was a teenager. She genuinely believed that public embarrassment would force me to surrender and reinstate her credit cards just to make the scene stop. Richard was taking a different approach. He was pounding his fist aggressively on the marble reception desk, demanding that the front desk coordinator call me down immediately. He was red in the face, his usual composed country club demeanor completely shattered by the reality of his bouncing checks and frozen accounts. He was barking orders, acting as though he owned the building and everyone inside it. He demanded to know who was in charge and threatened to have people fired if they did not comply with his demands. Allison was standing slightly behind them, looking like a furious teenager who had just been grounded. Her aesthetic vibe was completely gone. Her designer clothes looked rumpled, and her mascara was slightly smudged, likely from the panic attack she had suffered outside her padlocked boutique earlier that morning. She crossed her arms tightly, glaring at the security personnel who were slowly closing in around them. In the past, my heart would have been pounding out of my chest. The fear of public humiliation and the overwhelming guilt of making my mother cry would have completely paralyzed me. I would have rushed down the stairs begging them to be quiet, promising to fix whatever they wanted just to restore the peace. But looking down at them from the balcony today, I felt absolutely nothing. No fear, no anxiety, just a cold, clinical amusement. They looked so incredibly small. They looked pathetic. I walked down the glass staircase, my heels clicking rhythmically against the steps. The sharp sound echoed through the high-ceilinged lobby, drawing their attention immediately. My father pointed a trembling, angry finger at me, opening his mouth to shout another aggressive demand. Before he could speak a single word, I raised my hand, silencing him with a single sharp gesture. I turned to Brian, the head of my building security, who was already reaching for his radio to call for police backup. "Do not call the police, Brian," I said, my voice projecting clearly and calmly across the quiet lobby. "Please escort them into the main executive conference room." The main executive conference room was positioned right in the center of the office floor. It was constructed entirely of soundproof glass from floor to ceiling. It was essentially a massive, luxurious fishbowl. I wanted them in there for a very specific reason. I wanted my staff and my clients to see exactly how I handled extortion. I wanted my family to realize that they were not staging a hostile takeover. They had simply walked willingly into a cage where I controlled all the oxygen. My parents and sister eagerly stormed toward the conference room, looking triumphant. They pushed past Brian, their heads held high. They genuinely believed that by forcing me to take them into a private room, they had won the first battle. They thought I was hiding them away to save face, and that behind closed doors, I would finally break down and apologize. I stopped briefly at my assistant's desk. I did not grab my laptop. I did not bring a pen or a notepad to take down their demands. I bypassed the tall stacks of client contracts and picked up a single thin manila folder. It was the only thing I needed. I walked into the glass room where my father was already pacing back and forth like a caged animal. My mother was wiping her fake tears, waiting for her cue to start guilt-tripping me. Allison was glaring at me, ready to demand her boutique back. I stepped over the threshold and pulled the heavy glass door shut behind me. The thick seal engaged instantly, cutting off the ambient noise of the busy office outside. The silence in the room was sudden, heavy, and suffocating. I stood at the head of the long, polished table, holding the manila folder, looking at the three people who used to terrify me. I was completely in control. My father did not waste a single second. The heavy glass door had barely clicked shut before he marched over to the long, polished mahogany table and slammed both of his hands down onto the surface. The loud crack echoed off the soundproof walls, but I did not even blink. I just stood at the head of the table, watching him with absolute detachment. "Call your bank right now," Richard demanded, his voice thick with rage. His face was flushed a deep, angry red, and the veins in his neck were visibly bulging. "I do not care what kind of temper tantrum you are throwing today, Claire. You do not get to unilaterally cut off your own family. My business accounts are frozen. The golf club just called me about a bounced payment. You are going to pick up your phone, call your wealth manager, and reinstate the credit lines immediately." Patricia stepped up right beside him, pressing her hands against her chest in a gesture of exaggerated suffering. She looked around the luxurious conference room as if she was a hostage in a dungeon. "How could you do this to us?" she whimpered, her voice trembling with manufactured grief. "I was completely humiliated at the salon this morning. My friends were watching as my card was declined. You are acting like a complete psychopath, Claire. You need to fix this right now before you cause permanent damage to this family. Before I could even address my parents. Allison shoved her way forward. She slammed her expensive designer purse onto the table, glaring at me with a look of pure, unadulterated venom. I do not care about Mom's salon appointment right now. She snapped, her voice shrill and frantic. You need to call my landlord immediately. Allison pointed a shaking, manicured finger at my face. The property management company showed up at my boutique an hour ago with a locksmith, Claire. They literally forced my employees out onto the sidewalk and put a padlock on the front door. They handed me a notice saying the financial guarantor formally withdrew backing and that my lease is in default. You are going to call them right now and tell them it was a massive banking error. Tell them you are still backing my business. You are ruining my entire life over some stupid misunderstanding. I looked at the three of them. They were breathing heavily, completely consumed by their own panic and entitlement. They had stormed into my corporate office, disrupted my business, and attempted to publicly shame me. And yet, even now, standing in my conference room, they were still giving me orders. They still believed they held the authority. They still thought I was the obedient scapegoat who would eventually cave under the weight of their demands. I took a slow, deliberate breath. The air in the room felt incredibly crisp and clean. I looked down at the single thin manila folder in my hands. I stepped closer to the table and calmly placed the folder onto the polished wood. With a swift flick of my wrist, I slid the folder directly across the long table. It glided smoothly over the surface and came to a perfect stop right in front of Allison. Open it, I said, my voice soft, but carrying an absolute, undeniable authority. Allison looked down at the folder and then back up at me, her eyes narrowing with suspicion. What is this? She demanded. I do not want to look at your stupid paperwork, Claire. I want you to pick up the phone and call the property manager. I am not calling anyone, I replied, folding my arms across my chest. I highly suggest you open the folder, Allison. It directly concerns the future of your precious aesthetic lifestyle brand. With an angry, dramatic huff, Allison snatched the folder off the table and flipped it open. Richard and Patricia leaned in close, staring at the documents inside. The room went completely silent as Allison's eyes scanned the thick legal jargon printed on the crisp white paper. I watched the exact moment her brain processed what she was looking at. The angry flush of color completely drained from her face, leaving her skin looking like dull chalk. Her mouth fell open slightly, and her hands began to tremble so violently that the papers rustled in the quiet room. What is it? Patricia asked, her voice suddenly losing its theatrical edge. Allison, what does it say? Allison could not speak. She just stared at the signature line at the bottom of the document, her eyes wide with absolute horror. Since my sister seems to have lost her ability to speak, I will explain it to you, I said, breaking the heavy silence. That document is the official property deed for the commercial building located at the corner of Maple and Elm. The exact building where your boutique is currently located, Allison. Richard frowned, his heavy brows pulling together in profound confusion. What are you talking about, Claire? That building is owned by a massive commercial real estate conglomerate. You are just the financial guarantor on her lease. Not anymore, I corrected him, a cold smile playing on my lips. 3 months ago, the original property group decided to liquidate some of their downtown assets. The building went up for private sale. I thought it was a fantastic investment opportunity. So I had my corporate lawyer utilize a blind limited liability company to purchase the building entirely in cash. I took a slow step around the table, walking directly toward them. The power dynamic in the room shifted so violently, I could almost feel the change in the air pressure. My family instinctively took a step back as I approached. I did not just withdraw as your financial guarantor. Allison. I continued, my voice slicing through the quiet room like a freshly sharpened blade. I am the sole owner of the property management company that you have been dealing with, which means I am the one who sent the locksmith to your boutique this morning. Allison dropped the folder onto the table as if it had suddenly caught fire. She looked at me with an expression of pure, terrified disbelief. "You bought my building?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. "You bought the building and you locked me out. You cannot do this to me, Claire. I put my entire soul into that boutique. It is my dream." "You put my money into that boutique," I corrected her sharply. "Let us be entirely clear about the reality of your situation. You have never been a self-made entrepreneur. You have been playing dress-up using my corporate credit lines. You have not turned a profit in 3 years. You have not paid rent in 2 months because you assumed I would just quietly cover the deficit like I always do." I stopped just a few feet away from her, looking directly into her panicked eyes. I delivered the absolute final blow. "I am your landlord, Allison, and because you have not paid rent in 2 months, you are officially evicted. The padlock stays on the door. My legal team will be liquidating whatever cheap inventory you have left inside to cover your outstanding debts. Your boutique is completely finished." The silence that followed was deafening. Outside the glass walls, I could see my employees walking back and forth, completely unaware of the absolute destruction taking place inside the conference room. My mother let out a sharp gasp, gripping the edge of the mahogany table as if her legs were about to give out. My father stood completely paralyzed, his mouth opening and closing as he tried to formulate a response. He was a man who prided himself on control, but he was suddenly realizing that he had absolutely no leverage left. "This is illegal," Richard finally sputtered, pointing a shaking finger at me. "You cannot just buy a building and evict your own sister without notice. I will hire a lawyer, Claire. I will sue you for everything you own. I will drag your public relations firm through the mud." I laughed directly in his face, a genuine cold laugh that echoed off the glass walls. "Sue me, Richard," I challenged him, spreading my arms wide. "Please hire a lawyer. Go ahead and explain to a judge how you and your unemployed son-in-law committed wire fraud by draining $50,000 from my emergency account yesterday morning. Because I have the bank records. I have the wire transfer receipts. And my corporate attorney has already prepared the documents to hand over to the police the moment you decide to threaten me again." My father froze, the color completely draining from his face. The mention of the stolen $50,000 extinguished the fire of his anger, instantly replacing it with stark, terrifying reality. He knew he had committed a crime. He knew that I had the evidence. And he was finally realizing that I was absolutely willing to use it. "You thought I was weak?" I said, lowering my voice to a dangerous whisper. "You thought because I wanted a family, I would just let you use me as a human bank account for the rest of my life. You stole $50,000 from me and told me to sit down and be quiet. Well, I am standing up now, and I am taking absolutely everything back." Patricia began to cry again, but this time there was no theatrical performance. These were real tears of absolute panic. "Claire, please," she begged, reaching out a trembling hand toward me. "You are destroying us. Where are we supposed to go? What are we supposed to do?" "That sounds like a personal problem, Patricia," I replied, completely unmoved by her tears. "I suggest you start learning how to live within your actual means, because the free ride is permanently over." Allison was sobbing uncontrollably, now leaning heavily against the glass wall of the conference room. Her perfect life, her social media aesthetic, her entire identity had just been incinerated in less than 5 minutes. She had absolutely nothing left. Just as I turned to tell them to get out of my office, the heavy glass door of the conference room was suddenly yanked open. The thick seal popped loudly, breaking the heavy tension in the room. I turned around to see Dion storming into the space. He was out of breath, his designer suit jacket flying open, his face contorted into a mask of pure aggressive rage. He had evidently just received the news about the boutique and had rushed downtown to play the role of the protective alpha male. He had absolutely no idea that he was walking directly into a trap that I had meticulously set just for him. Dayon marched into this conference room with the heavy, exaggerated strides of a man desperately trying to project authority. He bypassed my parents completely and walked straight toward the head of the polished mahogany table where I was standing. His expensive designer suit jacket flared open, revealing a silk shirt that was already sticking to his chest with nervous sweat. He pointed a rigid, trembling finger directly at my face. "What the hell do you think you are doing, Claire?" He shouted, his voice echoing aggressively off the soundproof glass walls. "I just got a frantic call from Allison. She is standing on the sidewalk like a common criminal while some property manager tells her that her lease is terminated. You have absolutely no right to interfere with her business operations." Before I could even respond, Allison rushed over to him, grabbing his arm and pressing her face against his shoulder. "Dion, you have to stop her," she sobbed, her voice muffled against his expensive silk shirt. "She bought the building. She is the landlord. She is officially evicting me and taking all my inventory. You have to call your lawyers. You have to make her fix this right now." Dion stiffened, his eyes darting toward the manila folder resting on the table. For a split second, I saw a flash of genuine panic cross his face, but he quickly masked it with a sneer of arrogant bravado. He planted his hands firmly on the table, leaning his weight forward to try and physically intimidate me. He wanted to look like the protective husband standing up to the jealous, bitter sister. "Listen to me very carefully," Claire, Dion growled, lowering his voice to a threatening register. "You are way out of your depth here. I have a team of corporate attorneys on retainer for my tech startup. What you are doing right now constitutes tortious interference and corporate sabotage. I will personally file a lawsuit against you and your public relations firm for defamation. I will tie you up in civil court for the next 10 years until you are completely bankrupt. You are going to pick up your phone, call the property management group, and unlock my wife's boutique this instant." My father, who had been standing completely paralyzed in the corner, suddenly found his courage again. Dion's arrival seemed to reignite Richard's patriarchal confidence. "That is exactly right, Dion," my father chimed in, puffing out his chest and stepping forward. "You show her. She has lost her mind today. She froze my business accounts and humiliated your mother. She needs to understand that she cannot just throw her weight around without facing serious legal consequences." I looked at the three of them forming a united front against me. Dion, the supposed tech mogul; Richard, the entitled patriarch; Allison, the weeping victim. They were all banking on the illusion that Dion possessed some sort of massive financial and legal power that could force me into submission. They were relying on a shield made entirely of lies. I did not step back. I did not raise my voice to match his volume. Instead, I looked directly into Dion's angry, desperate eyes, and I laughed. It was not a forced laugh or a nervous chuckle. It was a genuine, cold expression of pure amusement that bubbled up from the absolute certainty of my victory. The sound of my laughter caught Dion completely off guard. His aggressive posture faltered for a fraction of a second, and his brow furrowed in deep confusion. He was expecting me to cower. He was expecting me to be intimidated by his empty threats of litigation. "You want to sue me, Dion?" I asked, a wide, dangerous smile spreading across my face. "I would absolutely love that. Please, I am begging you to file a lawsuit against me for corporate sabotage. Do you have any idea how much I would enjoy the discovery phase of that civil trial?" Dion's jaw clenched and he stood up straight, crossing his arms tightly over his chest. "I do not play games, Claire," he warned, his voice losing a fraction of its commanding edge. "My lawyers will completely destroy your agency." "Your lawyers do not exist, Dion," I replied, my tone dropping into a deadly serious whisper that commanded the entire room. "But my private investigator certainly does, and he works very fast." The blood instantly stopped flowing to Dion's face. The smug, arrogant mask he had worn since the day I met him began to crack, fracturing right down the middle. I took a slow, deliberate step toward him, ensuring that every single word I said landed like a physical blow. "Let us talk about your revolutionary tech startup, Dion," I said, my voice dripping with absolute venom. "Let us talk about the bridge funding you needed so desperately this morning. You told Richard that you needed $50,000 to secure a development team. But my investigator tracked the routing numbers on that wire transfer. The money never went to a software company. It went into a shell account and was immediately routed to an offshore banking institution in the Cayman Islands." Allison stopped crying and pulled her face away from Dion's chest. She looked up at him, her tear-stained face completely blank with confusion. "Dion, what is she talking about?" Allison whispered. I ignored her and kept my eyes locked entirely on Dion. I was not finished dismantling him. "Tell your wife about the offshore accounts, Dion," I demanded, stepping even closer. "Tell her about the illegal sports betting syndicate you owe a massive amount of money to. Tell Richard how you convinced him to steal $50,000 from his own daughter's emergency fund just so you could pay off a dangerous gambling debt and avoid getting your legs broken." Dion's mouth opened, but absolutely no sound came out. He looked like a man who had just stepped off a cliff and was suspended in midair, waiting for gravity to pull him down to his death. The sweat on his forehead was gleaming under the bright fluorescent lights of the conference room. And while you are explaining that, I continued seamlessly delivering the final catastrophic strike. "You should probably also explain the federal court filings. The Securities and Exchange Commission has been quietly investigating your fake startup for wire fraud for the last 6 months. My investigator assures me that the federal authorities are preparing to unseal an indictment against you very soon. So please, Dion, file that civil lawsuit against me. Let us get all of your financial records entered into the public court registry. I am sure the federal prosecutors would love to see them." The silence that slammed into the conference room was heavier than concrete. It was the absolute suffocating silence of total destruction. My father looked back and forth between me and Dion, his eyes wide with stark terror. Richard was a proud, arrogant man, but he was not entirely stupid. He saw the look of absolute naked panic on Dion's face. He saw the way the younger man was physically trembling. In that single horrifying moment, my father realized that he had not just stolen money from me to fund a brilliant investment. He had committed a felony to pay off an illegal gambling debt for a grifter. He was an accessory to wire fraud. Patricia let out a low, whimpering sound, covering her mouth with both of her hands. Her entire world, her country club reputation, her perfect family image was evaporating right in front of her eyes. Dion did not try to deny it. He did not yell or threaten me again. The illusion was completely shattered, and he knew that I held the power to send him to federal prison with a single phone call. His survival instinct completely overrode his pride. He turned his head and looked at the heavy glass door leading out to the lobby. "We are leaving," Dion said, his voice hoarse and completely stripped of any alpha male confidence. He reached out and grabbed Allison's arm, his fingers digging roughly into her fabric. He did not look at my parents. He did not look back at me. He just pulled his wife violently toward the exit. "Wait!" Allison cried out, stumbling slightly in her high heels as Dion dragged her toward the door. "Dion, wait, my boutique. What about my boutique? We cannot just leave." "Shut up, Allison," Dion hissed viciously, yanking the heavy glass door open. "We are leaving right now." He dragged her out of the conference room and into the busy reception area. My father and mother stood frozen for a few seconds, completely shell-shocked by the rapid collapse of their champion. Richard looked at me, his mouth opening as if he wanted to apologize, as if he wanted to beg me to protect him from the mess he had helped create. But he saw the absolute zero temperature in my eyes. He realized that I was no longer his daughter. I was his executioner. Richard grabbed Patricia's arm and practically dragged her out of the room, following desperately behind Dion and Allison. I walked slowly to the threshold of the conference room and stood in the open doorway. I watched them practically sprint across the polished marble floor of my lobby, passing by my confused receptionists and my wealthy clients. They looked exactly like what they were. A group of panicked, terrified criminals fleeing the scene of their own disaster. They reached the glass elevator bank at the end of the hall. Dion frantically smashed the call button, looking over his shoulder to see if I was following them. The stainless steel doors slid open, and the four of them piled inside, pressing themselves against the back wall of the cab. The doors slid shut, swallowing them whole and carrying them down to the street. I stood in my beautiful glass tower, listening to the soft hum of my thriving business operating around me. My phone buzzed in my pocket, but I ignored it. I walked back over to the conference table, picked up the manila folder, and neatly tucked the property deed back inside. The ambush was over, and I had won the battle without breaking a single sweat. But I knew the war was not entirely finished. They were desperate now, and desperate people always try to spin the narrative to protect their own egos. They would retreat to their affluent suburban neighborhood and try to build a wall of lies to protect themselves from the social fallout. They would need a stage to perform their final act of deception. And looking at the calendar app on my smartwatch, I knew exactly where that stage would be. Thanksgiving was only 2 weeks away. Patricia would never cancel her grand holiday dinner. She would rather die than let the neighborhood think her perfect family was falling apart. She would host her party, and Dion would undoubtedly try to charm his way out of the consequences. They thought today was the worst day of their lives. They had no idea I was bringing a hurricane to dinner. 2 weeks passed since the absolute destruction in my glass conference room. 14 days of complete radio silence from my family. They did not call to apologize. They did not attempt to negotiate. I knew exactly what they were doing. They were scrambling. My corporate legal team had officially liquidated the remaining inventory of Allison's downtown boutique to cover her back rent. The property was currently sitting empty, waiting for a new paying tenant. My father's lenders had undoubtedly received the formal withdrawal of my financial backing and called in his outstanding bridge loans. Dion was likely living in a state of constant paranoia, jumping at every shadow, assuming the federal authorities were finally coming to put him in handcuffs. Their world was rapidly collapsing around them, but they were absolutely terrified of letting anyone else see the cracks in their perfect facade. That is why I knew Patricia would never cancel her annual Thanksgiving gala. For 20 years, my mother had hosted the most extravagant holiday dinner in our affluent suburban neighborhood. It was not a warm family gathering. It was a highly orchestrated performance designed to flaunt her wealth and assert her social dominance. She hired private catering companies, professional florists, and valet drivers. She invited extended family members, wealthy neighbors, and local politicians. Canceling the dinner would have been a public admission of failure. She would rather go completely bankrupt than let the neighborhood gossip about why the colonial house was dark on Thanksgiving night. I did not receive an invitation this year, but I certainly did not need one. I arrived at the house at 6 o'clock in the evening, exactly 1 hour after the cocktail reception was scheduled to begin. I parked my car 2 blocks away to avoid the valet drivers and walked down the crisp autumn street. The air was cold and smelled faintly of wood smoke. I was dressed for a war. I wore a tailored emerald green designer dress that fit perfectly, falling just below my knees, paired with pristine black stiletto heels. My hair was styled flawlessly, and my makeup was sharp and precise. I looked powerful. I looked like a woman who completely owned every room she walked into. I looked like the absolute opposite of a woman having a mental breakdown. I walked up the long brick driveway, bypassing the front door completely. I knew the caterers would be using the side entrance near the kitchen to bring in the massive trays of food. I slipped through the side gate and walked through the open service door, stepping quietly into the back hallway of my parents' sprawling home. The smell of roasted turkey, sage, stuffing, and expensive wine filled the air. I could hear the loud ambient noise of 50 people chatting, laughing, and clinking crystal glasses in the grand living room just down the hall. I walked silently down the corridor, stopping just behind the heavy oak archway that separated the hallway from the main living space. From the shadows, I had a perfect vantage point of the entire room. The house was packed. The elite of the Chicago suburbs were standing in small groups holding plates of expensive appetizers. Dion was standing in the far corner, sweating profusely and drinking what looked like straight whiskey, holding tightly to Allison's hand. Allison looked exhausted, her eyes darting nervously around the room, trying desperately to maintain her aesthetic smile for the guests. My father was loudly discussing golf with a local judge, trying to project his usual arrogant confidence, but his posture was rigid and defensive. And then there was Patricia. She was holding court in the center of the room, surrounded by my Aunt Helen and several prominent neighborhood wives, including Cynthia, a woman who practically ran the local country club gossip mill. I stood perfectly still in the shadows listening as my mother spun the most magnificent malicious lie I had ever heard. "It has just been a completely tragic month for our family," Patricia said, her voice dripping with manufactured sorrow. She pressed a hand to her chest, sighing heavily for dramatic effect. "We are trying to stay positive, but it is breaking Richard's heart. We just do not know what to do about Claire." Aunt Helen gasped softly, leaning in closer. "What happened to Claire?" she asked. "Is she sick? I noticed she was not here tonight." Patricia lowered her voice to a conspiratorial whisper, but kept it just loud enough for the surrounding guests to hear. "She is having a severe mental breakdown," Patricia said, shaking her head tragically. The pressure of running her public relations firm completely fractured her mind. She has been acting incredibly erratic, aggressive, and paranoid. She actually locked us out of our own accounts and started hallucinating that we were trying to steal from her. It has been a complete nightmare. Cynthia covered her mouth in shock. "Oh my goodness, Patricia, that is absolutely terrifying. Is she in a hospital getting psychiatric help? We are trying to get her committed into a private facility." Patricia lied smoothly, taking a slow sip of her wine. "Richard has been working tirelessly with our corporate lawyers all week. We are filing for an emergency legal conservatorship. The courts understand that she is no longer competent to manage her own finances or her business. We are stepping in to take control of her assets to protect her from completely destroying her own life. It is a heavy burden, but family comes first. We have to save her from herself." I stood behind the archway, feeling the cold, absolute reality of her words wash over me. They were not just lying to cover up their financial ruin. They were actively executing a smear campaign to legally institutionalize me. They wanted to convince the world that I was insane so they could steal my money through a court-ordered conservatorship. It was the ultimate form of toxic gaslighting. They were perfectly willing to completely destroy my reputation, my career, and my freedom just to keep their country club memberships active. Any remaining shred of pity I had for them evaporated in that exact moment. They wanted to talk about my mental state. I was going to give them a demonstration of absolute, terrifying clarity. I adjusted my posture, lifting my chin and pulling my shoulders back. I stepped out from the shadows of the hallway and walked directly into the bright, warm light of the grand living room. My stiletto heels clicked sharply against the polished hardwood floor, cutting through the ambient noise like a gunshot. I did not sneak into the room. I walked straight down the center, parting the crowd of wealthy guests like the Red Sea. I moved with absolute grace and unshakable confidence, my emerald green dress catching the light from the massive crystal chandelier overhead. Cynthia was the first person to notice me. She was still looking at Patricia with a sympathetic expression, when her eyes darted past my mother's shoulder and landed on me. Cynthia's jaw dropped open slightly, her eyes widening in absolute shock. She had just been told that I was a raving lunatic waiting to be locked in a psychiatric ward. Instead, she was looking at a poised, successful executive who looked like she owned the entire building. The ripple effect was instantaneous. Aunt Helen turned her head and gasped. A man standing nearby stopped talking mid-sentence. Slowly, one by one, the guests noticed me walking through the room. The loud, lively chatter began to die down. The clinking of glasses stopped. The background jazz music suddenly sounded incredibly loud as the human voices completely faded away. Within 10 seconds, the entire grand living room went dead silent. 50 people were staring at me, completely mesmerized by the sudden shift in the atmosphere. Patricia, noticing the sudden silence, turned around with a polite, confused smile on her face. Her eyes met mine, and the crystal wine glass slipped right out of her fingers. It hit the hardwood floor, shattering into dozens of pieces, splashing red wine across the polished wood like blood. Patricia could not speak. The color drained from her face so fast, she looked like she might actually faint. Her perfect, tragic lie had just walked into the room, wearing Tom Ford. Across the room, Richard stopped talking to the local judge. His face went pale and his hands clenched into tight fists at his sides. Dion practically choked on his whiskey, coughing violently into his hand, while Allison looked like she wanted the floor to open up and swallow her whole. I stopped walking when I was exactly 5 feet away from my mother. I looked at her, completely ignoring the shattered glass at her feet. I swept my gaze across the silent room, making deliberate eye contact with Aunt Helen and Cynthia. I offered them a warm, perfectly composed smile. "Good evening, everyone," I said, my voice smooth, projected, and absolutely dripping with professional charm. "I apologize for arriving late. Running a highly successful business can keep you tied up at the office, but I simply could not miss my mother's famous Thanksgiving dinner." I turned my attention back to Patricia, who was trembling visibly, her mouth opening and closing without producing a single sound. "I overheard you talking about me in the hallway, Mother," I said, raising one perfectly manicured eyebrow. "A severe mental breakdown, an emergency legal conservatorship. That is a fascinating narrative. I am curious, though. Did you tell your friends that you need a conservatorship because I lost my mind, or did you tell them you need it because I froze your credit cards after you and Dion committed wire fraud?" The silence in the room became so heavy it was practically suffocating. The guests collectively stopped breathing. I had just taken a sledgehammer to the very foundation of their perfect suburban illusion. The setup was complete. It was time to show the entire neighborhood exactly what my family was hiding behind their expensive closed doors. The absolute silence in the grand living room was suddenly broken by the sound of heavy, aggressive footsteps. The initial shock that had paralyzed my family was wearing off, and my father's sheer patriarchal rage was rapidly taking its place. Richard pushed his way past Cynthia and Aunt Helen, his face flushed a dangerous shade of crimson. He marched directly toward me, his jaw clenched so tightly I could see the muscles jumping in his cheeks. He stepped deliberately into my path, blocking my access to the rest of the room. He positioned his large frame just inches from mine, trying to use his physical size to intimidate me, the same way he had done when I was a terrified teenager. He leaned down, leaning his face close to mine, so the wealthy guests hovering nearby could not hear his exact words. He smelled of expensive scotch and nervous sweat. "You have lost your mind, Claire." Richard hissed, his voice a low, venomous whisper. "You have absolutely no right to walk into my home and humiliate your mother in front of our friends. You are not welcome in this house. Unless you brought a cashier's check in that designer bag to fix your catastrophic mistakes and turn my credit lines back on, you need to turn around and walk out that door before I have security physically remove you." I looked up at his flushed, angry face. A few weeks ago, the sheer intensity of his anger would have made my hands shake. I would have folded in on myself, apologizing frantically to keep the peace. But standing there in my tailored emerald dress, I felt absolutely nothing but cold, clinical amusement. The man threatening to have me thrown out was currently drowning in debt that I had historically paid for. He was a paper tiger roaring at the very person who owned the paper. "Are you going to physically remove me, Richard?" I asked, my voice perfectly calm and completely conversational. "Are you going to drag your own daughter out the door in front of the local judge, the country club board of directors, and half of your neighborhood? Please go right ahead." I am sure Cynthia would absolutely love to detail that specific event in her next country club newsletter. Richard's eyes darted nervously to the side. He saw Cynthia standing just a few feet away, pretending to examine a floral arrangement while hanging on to every single word we were saying. His hands twitched at his sides, but he did not dare touch me. His cowardice was entirely predictable. He cared more about the opinions of the people in this room than he cared about anything else in the world. While Richard was paralyzed by his own social anxiety, Dayon decided to make his move. I looked past my father's shoulder and saw Dion standing at the head of the massive formal dining table in the adjacent room. The table was perfectly set with fine china, heavy crystal goblets, and tall glowing candles. Dayon had let go of Allison's hand and was straightening the lapels of his designer suit jacket. The sheer panic I had seen on his face just moments ago had been replaced by a familiar, arrogant smirk. During the 2 weeks of radio silence, Dion had clearly convinced himself that I was bluffing. He had likely reasoned that offshore banking accounts in the Cayman Islands were notoriously difficult to trace. He assumed my private investigator had simply guessed where the money went, and that I had absolutely no hard physical evidence to back up my claims. He thought his secret was safe, as long as he maintained control of the family narrative. He genuinely believed that these wealthy elite guests would side with the charismatic tech entrepreneur over the sister who had just been branded as mentally unstable. "Richard, please step aside." Dion called out, his voice, loud, smooth, and projecting perfectly across the quiet rooms. He offered the guests a deeply sympathetic and condescending smile, playing the role of the patient, protective family man to absolute perfection. "We all know Claire is going through a very severe mental health crisis right now." Dion continued, shaking his head with manufactured sadness. "She is confused. She is making wild, aggressive accusations because she is completely detached from reality. We need to show her grace. Let her stay, Richard. We are her family, and we will get her the psychiatric help she desperately needs." A soft murmur of sympathetic whispers rippled through the crowd of guests. Aunt Helen looked at me with genuine pity. Dion was brilliant at manipulating the room. He was actively gaslighting me in front of 50 witnesses, using my mother's lie about my mental state to completely discredit the truth about his wire fraud. He thought he had just checkmated me. He thought he had successfully boxed me into a corner where any anger or defense I displayed would just look like the frantic ranting of a crazy woman. Allison, emboldened by her husband's fake confidence, stepped up beside him at the dining table. "Yes, Claire," she chimed in, her voice trembling with fake emotion. "Please, just sit down. Stop fighting us. We just want you to get better." I looked at the two of them standing at the head of the lavish holiday table. They were so incredibly smug, so entirely certain that their web of lies was impenetrable. They had relied on my silence for 35 years. They thought that social decorum and the fear of making a scene would force me to back down and quietly leave. I did not back down. I looked at Richard, who was still standing directly in my path. I did not step backward. I stepped forward, forcing him to either physically put his hands on me or step out of my way. The cold, absolute authority in my eyes made him freeze. His self-preservation instincts kicked in, and he shifted his weight, stepping awkwardly to the side. I walked straight past him without breaking my stride, my stiletto heels continuing their sharp, rhythmic click against the hardwood floor. I crossed the threshold from the living room into the grand dining room, walking directly toward Dion and Allison. The guests parted for me, automatically watching my every move with breathless anticipation. I was not walking like a woman having a mental breakdown. I was walking like an executive preparing to terminate an entire department. I reached the long dining table. I did not look at my sister or her grifter husband. I smoothly reached out and picked up a pristine crystal champagne flute from the table setting nearest to me. With my other hand, I picked up a heavy silver dessert spoon. I turned to face the entire crowd of guests who were now crowding around the archway to see what was happening. I raised the crystal glass and tapped the side of it with the silver spoon. Ding, ding, ding. The sharp, clear sound cut through the heavy tension in the room, commanding the absolute attention of every single person present. The room went so quiet you could hear the soft crackling of the fireplace in the background. "Thank you all so much for coming tonight," I said, my voice carrying effortlessly across the large space. "It is truly wonderful to see so many familiar faces gathered here to celebrate Thanksgiving. I know Patricia and Dion have been filling your heads with some incredibly creative and tragic fiction during the cocktail hour. I understand they have painted a very concerning picture of my mental health." I took a slow, deliberate step, pacing along the edge of the beautifully decorated table. "They told you that the pressure of my business fractured my mind. They told you that they are filing for a legal conservatorship to take control of my assets and protect me from myself." It is a brilliant story, I continued, offering a polite, detached smile to the local judge standing near the back. "It is designed to elicit your sympathy. It is designed to make them look like loving, protective family members making a difficult choice." I stopped pacing and locked eyes with Cynthia, whose eyes were wide with pure, unadulterated curiosity. But it is a complete and total fabrication, I stated, my voice dropping an octave, replacing the polite charm with absolute steel. There is no mental breakdown, there is no psychiatric facility, and there will certainly be no legal conservatorship. The reason my mother is standing in the corner trembling right now is not because she is sad. It is because she is absolutely terrified that you are all about to find out the truth about how they fund this beautiful, perfect lifestyle. Dion's smirk completely vanished. He gripped the back of the dining chair so hard his knuckles turned stark white. "Claire, that is enough," he barked, abandoning his patient tone completely. "You are making a scene. Stop talking right now." I turned my head slowly and looked directly into Dion's panicked eyes. I smiled a cold, ruthless smile that made him physically flinch. "I am not making a scene, Dion," I corrected him softly. "I am holding a press conference. And considering you are the main subject of tonight's presentation, I highly suggest you pay attention." I reached down and unclasped the gold latch of my designer handbag. The sharp metallic click sounded like a hammer pulling back on a loaded weapon. I had let them build their perfect stage. I had let them gather their perfect audience. Now it was time to show the elite neighborhood exactly who Dion really was, and exactly why the bank was permanently closed. I reached my hand deep into the silk lining of my designer handbag. My fingers brushed against the thick, heavy stack of printed documents I had brought with me. I had asked my assistant to print 20 complete copies of the financial dossier Thomas had compiled. I pulled the stack out into the warm light of the dining room. The crisp white paper contrasted sharply against my emerald green dress. I did not throw them. I did not act manic. I moved with the calm, deliberate precision of a casino dealer handing out the final cards of a high-stakes game. I stepped toward Cynthia, who was practically vibrating with morbid curiosity. I handed her the top packet. She took it eagerly, her eyes immediately darting down to the highlighted text on the first page. I handed the next packet to the local judge. I continued down the line, handing copies to Aunt Helen, to my parents' wealthy neighbors, and to the extended family members who had just spent the last hour listening to my mother call me insane. "Please feel free to read along," I said, my voice projecting clearly over the soft rustling of paper. 2 weeks ago, my father, Richard, authorized a wire transfer of $50,000 from a joint emergency bank account directly into a shell account controlled by my brother-in-law, Dion. Richard told me I had no right to be angry. He told me the money was bridge funding for Dion's revolutionary tech startup. He told me that family comes first. I paused, letting my words sink in, as the guests flipped to the second page of the dossier. "If you look at page 3, you will see the exact routing numbers for that wire transfer," I continued. "You will also see that the money never went to a software development team. It never went to a legitimate business." Within 20 minutes of Richard stealing my money, that $50,000 was wired to an offshore banking institution located in the Cayman Islands. A sharp collective gasp rippled through the dining room. The local judge adjusted his glasses, staring at the banking records with a hardened professional scowl. Cynthia let out a low, shocked whisper, covering her mouth with her manicured hand. "Dion did not invest my money," I announced, turning my body so I was facing Dion directly. "Dion owed a massive debt to an illegal offshore sports betting syndicate. He lost every single penny of that $50,000 in less than 48 hours, gambling on athletic events he had absolutely no control over. My father did not fund a tech visionary. He funded a degenerate gambler who was desperate to keep his kneecaps intact." Dion's face was completely drained of blood. He looked like a corpse standing at the head of the Thanksgiving table. He opened his mouth to defend himself, but the lies simply would not come. The physical evidence was literally resting in the hands of the most powerful people in his social circle. There was no spinning this narrative. There was no gaslighting his way out of bank statements. But stealing my emergency fund to pay off his bookie is not even the worst part of this story, I said, my voice rising slightly to ensure every single person in the back of the room could hear me. "Please turn to page 7. The sound of 20 people simultaneously flipping pages echoed loudly in the quiet house. For the last 2 years, Dion has been soliciting investments for his so-called tech company, I explained. He has taken money from banks, from private lenders, and possibly from some of you sitting in this very room tonight. But the startup does not exist. It is a complete phantom entity used entirely to fund his gambling addiction and his luxury lifestyle. And the federal government knows it. I pointed a sharp, accusatory finger right at Dion's chest. According to the federal court filings included in your packets, the Securities and Exchange Commission has been actively investigating Dion's company for wire fraud for the last 6 months. I declared, dropping the ultimate truth bomb. The authorities are preparing to unseal a federal indictment. Dion is not a successful entrepreneur. He is a criminal facing federal prison time, and he used my father to facilitate his final desperate payout. The grand dining room absolutely exploded. The polite upper-class decorum vanished in an instant. The guests erupted into loud, chaotic whispers and shouts of absolute outrage. Aunt Helen dropped her glass of wine, entirely too stunned to hold it. The local judge slammed the dossier down onto the dining table, his face completely flushed with anger, realizing he had been mingling with a man actively under federal investigation. Cynthia was already tapping furiously on her phone, undoubtedly texting the entire country club board of directors to spread the scandal of the decade. But the loudest sound in the room did not come from the guests. It came from my sister. Allison turned slowly to look at Dion. Her perfect aesthetic facade completely dissolved, replaced by a mask of pure, unadulterated horror. She had spent the last 3 years bragging about her wealthy husband looking down on me for being single. She had defended him blindly, assuming his money was real, and his arrogance was justified. "Is it true?" Allison shrieked, her voice breaking into a hysterical sob. She lunged at Dion, grabbing the lapels of his expensive suit jacket. She shook him violently, her perfectly styled hair falling into her face. "Tell me it is a lie, Dion. Tell me she is making this up. Tell me you did not gamble away our entire future." Dion could not look her in the eye. He looked away, staring blankly at the hardwood floor, completely paralyzed by the absolute destruction of his ego. His silence was the loudest confession he could possibly give. "You lied to me!" Allison screamed, hitting him squarely in the chest with her closed fists. "You told me we were rich. You told me the boutique failing was not a big deal because your company was going public. You are going to prison." She let go of his jacket and stumbled backward, knocking over a crystal water goblet. It shattered against the table, spilling ice and water over the expensive linen tablecloth. Allison collapsed into a dining chair, sobbing so violently she could barely breathe. Patricia was not faring any better. My mother had sunk into a chair in the living room, her hands covering her face, weeping with loud, ugly gasps. Her entire social standing, her flawless reputation, her position as the queen of the neighborhood had just been publicly incinerated in less than 5 minutes. She knew that after tonight she would never be invited to another country club luncheon. She would be the outcast of her own carefully curated world. And then there was Richard. My father looked around the room, watching his wealthy friends turn their backs on him in disgust. He watched his golden child sobbing hysterically at the table. He watched the absolute ruin of his legacy unfolding under the bright crystal chandelier. His patriarchal pride could not process the shame. His ego demanded a target, and since he could not physically attack the truth, he decided to attack the messenger. Richard completely lost his mind. His face turned a terrifying shade of purple. The veins in his neck strained against his collar as he lunged forward, pushing through the crowd of shocked guests. He did not care who he was shoving. He did not care about maintaining appearances anymore. He stormed toward me, his arm raised, his finger pointing aggressively toward the heavy oak front door. "Get out!" Richard roared, his voice booming with such raw, violent fury that several guests physically jumped back. He was shaking uncontrollably, spitting the words out like venom. "You vicious, vindictive snake! You come in here and destroy your own family on a holiday. You humiliate your mother and ruin your sister. Get out of my house!" He took another step toward me, his chest heaving. "Get out of my house right now, Claire. I never want to see your face again. You are dead to me. Now get out." The entire room fell completely silent again, watching to see what I would do. They expected me to run. They expected me to be terrified by the sheer volume of his rage. But I did not move a single inch. I stood perfectly still in the center of the room. I let his furious echo fade into the high ceilings. I lowered my hands, folding them neatly in front of me. I looked at the beautiful crown molding. I looked at the expensive imported rugs. I looked at the grand dining table overflowing with roasted turkey and expensive side dishes. I took a slow, deep breath, taking in every single detail of the grand dining room. I looked at the imported Italian marble fireplace, the custom silk drapes, and the antique grandfather clock ticking softly in the corner of the room. Richard was breathing heavily, his arms still rigidly pointing toward the heavy oak front door. He was waiting for me to obey his command. He was waiting for the obedient scapegoat of the family to lower her head, apologize for making a scene, and retreat into the cold night. Instead of moving toward the door, I turned my body to fully face him. I let a small, almost imperceptible smile touch the corners of my mouth. "Your house, Richard?" I asked, my voice perfectly calm, cutting through the heavy tension of the room like a silver blade. "Are you absolutely certain about that?" He frowned, his outstretched arm faltering for a fraction of a second. "What are you talking about?" he growled, taking a half step forward, trying to reclaim his physical dominance. "Of course it is my house. I bought it. I paid for it. Now leave before I call the police and have you dragged out of here in handcuffs for trespassing." I did not break eye contact with him as I reached into my emerald green designer bag one final time. My fingers bypassed my wallet and my car keys, closing around a single crisp manila envelope. I pulled it out, holding it up so the light from the massive crystal chandelier hit the bright white label on the front. "Actually, Richard, about this house," I said smoothly, stepping toward the dining table. "I think the police might have a very different interpretation of who is trespassing here tonight." I opened the envelope and pulled out a thick stack of legal documents bound with a dark blue legal cover. I did not hand this document out to the guests. This document was reserved entirely for him. I walked over to the dining table, stepping carefully around the shattered glass from Allison's water goblet, and placed the document squarely in the center of the table right next to the massive roasted turkey. "This is a property deed," I announced, my voice projecting clearly to the surrounding crowd of wealthy neighbors and extended family. "Specifically, it is the registered master deed for this exact piece of real estate. The colonial home, the manicured lawns, the heated swimming pool in the back. Every single square foot of this property." Richard stared at the blue legal cover, his thick gray eyebrows pulling together in a mix of rage and sudden terrifying confusion. "What kind of forged garbage is this?" he spat, although his voice completely lacked its previous booming confidence. "I hold the mortgage on this property. I have lived here for 20 years. You are bluffing, Claire." I turned my back to him and faced the crowd, sweeping my gaze over their captivated faces. They were hanging on to every single word, completely mesmerized by the absolute collapse of the neighborhood patriarch. 3 years ago, Richard made a series of catastrophic investments in the commercial real estate market. I explained, my tone shifting into the polished delivery of a corporate executive giving a boardroom presentation. He leveraged absolutely everything he owned. He drained his savings accounts, and he maxed out every single line of credit available to him, trying to chase a bad deal. He went completely broke. And because he was entirely too proud to ask for professional help, he hid the financial ruin from everyone in this room. He even hid it from his own wife. Patricia looked up from her trembling hands, her tear-stained face snapping toward Richard in absolute shock. "Richard, is that true?" she whispered, her voice cracking. "Did you lose our money?" Richard did not answer her. He could not even look at her. He was staring at the blue document on the table as if it were a live explosive device waiting to detonate. He hid the truth so well I continued, stepping closer to my father, that the bank initiated formal foreclosure proceedings against this house. This beautiful historic colonial property was exactly 4 days away from being put on the public auction block. You were about to be forcefully evicted by the county sheriff in front of the entire neighborhood, and you were absolutely terrified of the humiliation. You knew that losing this house meant losing your country club status, your influential friends, and your perfect image. I paused, letting the absolute silence of the room amplify the weight of my words. So I stepped in, I said softly. I did not want my parents to be homeless. And more importantly, I knew Richard could not survive the social embarrassment of losing his precious status. So I hired my corporate attorney to contact your lenders. I used my corporate holding company to purchase the debt directly from the bank. I bought this entire property out of foreclosure using a blind limited liability company so your name would quietly be removed from the public default registry. I paid the bank in full in cash. The local judge standing near the archway let out a low whistle of pure disbelief. Cynthia was staring at Richard with her mouth completely open, absorbing the undeniable fact that the man who had been lecturing the neighborhood about financial responsibility for decades had been secretly bankrupt for 3 years. The illusion of the wealthy, successful patriarch was completely dead. You have not been paying a mortgage, Richard, I said, dropping the final crushing weight onto his shoulders. You have not owned this property for 36 months. You have been paying rent. You have been paying monthly rent directly to my holding company under a strictly structured lease agreement that my lawyers drew up. You are a tenant in my house. Richard stumbled backward, his knees hitting the edge of a heavy antique armchair. He collapsed into the seat, all the strength completely leaving his large frame. He looked like a balloon that had just been violently punctured. His mouth opened and closed, but he could not articulate a single word. His brain was desperately trying to process the magnitude of his absolute defeat. He was sitting in a house he did not own, surrounded by elite friends who now knew he was a complete fraud. And that brings us to the events of yesterday morning, I said, keeping the pressure unrelenting. You decided that my emergency bank account was yours to take. You stole $50,000 from me to bail out your fraudulent son-in-law. You told me that family comes first and that I should just accept the theft quietly. So I made a few phone calls. I completely severed my financial guarantor status, and I froze every single secondary credit line you possessed, including the specific corporate checking account you used to automatically draft your monthly rent payment. I walked right up to the armchair where Richard was sitting, leaning down slightly, so I was looking directly into his defeated, terrified eyes. Because I froze your accounts, your automatic draft bounced yesterday afternoon. I whispered, my voice cold, absolute, and completely void of any mercy. You missed your payment. And according to the ironclad lease agreement you signed with my holding company, a missed payment results in an immediate and unfixable breach of contract. The finality of the words hung in the air, heavy and absolute. Breach of contract. The phrase echoed in the absolute silence of the dining room. I watched the exact moment my father's brain finally processed the sheer magnitude of his ruin. The arrogant, patriarchal shell he had worn for decades completely shattered. His shoulders slumped forward, his chest caving in, as if the invisible weight of his lies had suddenly materialized and crushed him. He did not yell. He did not point his finger at me anymore. He just stared at the polished hardwood floor, a completely broken and pathetic man who had just been exposed as a fraud in front of everyone he spent his life trying to impress. The absolute reality of the situation was too much for my mother to handle. Patricia had spent her entire existence cultivating an image of flawless, aristocratic perfection. Her country club status, her wealthy friends, her expensive salon treatments, they were not just things she enjoyed. They were her entire identity. Hearing that she was not the wealthy matriarch of a successful family, but rather a bankrupt tenant renting from the daughter she despised, was a psychological blow she could not absorb. Patricia let out a high-pitched, breathless gasp. Her eyes rolled back into her head, and her knees completely buckled beneath her. She collapsed backward into the antique console table positioned against the living room wall. As she fell, her arm flailed wildly, striking a massive Waterford crystal vase filled with imported white lilies. The heavy crystal vase tipped over the edge and crashed onto the hardwood floor with a deafening shatter. Water and crushed flowers spilled everywhere, soaking into the expensive Persian rug. Patricia crumpled to the floor, lying motionless amidst the sparkling shards of broken glass. Normally, a woman fainting at a holiday party would prompt an immediate rush of concern. But tonight, the reaction was chillingly different. The wealthy elite guests, the people Patricia had spent 20 years hosting and flattering, did absolutely nothing. Aunt Helen took a deliberate step backward to avoid getting water on her designer shoes. Cynthia simply stared down at my unconscious mother, her expression a mixture of profound shock and cold judgment. No one rushed to help her. No one called for a doctor. In their eyes, Patricia was no longer a peer. She was a liability. She was the center of a massive, humiliating scandal, and in their social circle, proximity to scandal was a highly contagious disease. Richard slowly turned his head to look at his wife lying on the floor, but he did not move to help her either. He was completely paralyzed by his own public destruction. The illusion of their perfect family was entirely dead, leaving nothing but a tragic, hollow reality in its wake. While everyone in the room was momentarily distracted by the sound of the shattering crystal, Dion decided to make his final desperate move. I caught the movement out of the corner of my eye. Dion had slowly backed away from the dining table, releasing his grip on the chair. He looked at Allison, who was still sobbing uncontrollably into her hands, completely oblivious to her surroundings. He did not try to comfort her. He did not say goodbye. He simply turned his back on his wife and began edging toward the large sliding glass doors at the back of the dining room, which led out to the dark patio and the expansive driveway. He thought he could just slip away into the night. He thought he could abandon his wife, abandon his mess, and disappear before the absolute full weight of his crimes came crashing down on him. I did not move to stop him. I did not shout for anyone to grab him. I just stood in the center of the room, watching him reach out and wrap his trembling hand around the brass handle of the sliding glass door. I knew exactly what was waiting for him outside. As Dion slid the heavy glass door open, a sudden blinding explosion of red and blue light erupted in the darkness outside. The flashing emergency lights reflected violently against the sheer curtains and the large glass panes illuminating the entire dining room in harsh alternating colors. The guests gasped again, turning their attention from my unconscious mother to the backyard. Dion froze, his silhouette outlined sharply against the chaotic strobe of the police lights. He took one single step out onto the brick patio, but that was as far as he got. Two men wearing dark windbreakers with the letters FBI printed in bold yellow across the back stepped out from the shadows of the manicured hedges. They had been waiting quietly near the edge of the driveway, securing the perimeter of the property. I had not just kept Thomas, the private investigator's financial dossier, for myself. Early that afternoon, I had instructed my corporate attorney to forward the entire 15-page digital file, complete with the offshore routing numbers, and the shell account details directly to the local federal field office. The authorities already had a sealed indictment against Dion for wire fraud. I simply provided them with the exact geographical coordinates of their fugitive and the final piece of financial evidence they needed to secure a conviction. Dion did not even try to run. The arrogant, smooth-talking tech mogul completely vanished, leaving behind a terrified, trembling coward. One of the federal agents grabbed Dion by the shoulder, spinning him around and slamming him face first against the exterior brick wall of the house. The loud, authoritative shout of the federal agent commanding Dion to put his hands behind his back echoed clearly through the open sliding glass door. The sharp metallic click of handcuffs snapping shut around Dion's wrists rang out into the cold night air. Allison pulled her face out of her hands, her mascara running in dark streaks down her pale cheeks. She looked out the sliding glass door and screamed. It was a guttural, horrifying sound of a woman watching her entire future being dragged away in chains. She scrambled out of her chair, knocking it over backward, and rushed toward the patio. She stood in the open doorway weeping hysterically as the federal agents marched her husband across the lawn toward an unmarked black sport utility vehicle waiting at the end of the driveway. Dion kept his head down, refusing to look back at her. The guests in the dining room began to urgently shuffle toward the front door. The entertainment portion of the evening was officially over, and the reality of a federal raid was entirely too real for their comfortable suburban sensibilities. The local judge was the first to leave, walking briskly past Richard without saying a single word. Cynthia followed closely behind, already typing furiously on her phone. Within moments, the grand house began to empty out, leaving only the shattered remnants of my toxic family. I stood perfectly calm amidst the absolute wreckage. I had executed every single phase of my plan with flawless precision. I had severed the financial ties. I had exposed the fraud. I had reclaimed my property. There was only one final piece of business left to conclude. I walked slowly over to the grand dining table. The massive roasted Thanksgiving turkey sat perfectly untouched in the center, surrounded by elegant crystal serving dishes and expensive silver cutlery. I reached into my emerald green designer bag one last time. I pulled out a single crisp piece of heavy white paper. It was not a copy of a bank statement. It was not a printed dossier. It was a formal, legally binding 30-day notice of eviction drawn up and stamped by my corporate attorney. I stood at the head of the table where Dion had been standing just moments before. I looked at the beautiful, decadent holiday spread that my mother had arranged using the credit cards she thought I would pay for. I dropped the eviction notice directly onto the center of the table, letting it rest right on top of the untouched roasted turkey. The stark white paper with its bold legal print stood out sharply against the golden brown skin of the bird. Richard slowly lifted his head. His eyes were red-rimmed and completely hollow. He looked at the eviction notice sitting on the table, and then he looked up at me. There was no anger left in him. There was no patriarchal authority. There was only the absolute terrifying realization that he had completely destroyed his own life because he could not stop treating his daughter like a transaction. "You told me family comes first, Richard," I said, my voice quiet, steady and echoing in the nearly empty room. I looked at him, feeling an incredible sense of absolute closure. "But you never saw me as family. I was just your bank." I turned my head and looked at Allison, who was still kneeling on the patio, sobbing into the cold night air. I looked at Patricia, who was just beginning to stir on the floor, surrounded by broken glass and ruined lilies. Finally, I looked back at my father, delivering the absolute final truth of the evening. "And the bank is permanently closed." I did not wait for him to respond. I did not need to hear another lie, another excuse, or another desperate manipulation. I turned my back on the grand dining table and walked toward the hallway. My stiletto heels clicked rhythmically against the hardwood floor, a steady, confident drumbeat marking the end of an era. I walked out the heavy oak front door, stepping out onto the wide brick porch. The air was incredibly crisp, carrying the sharp, clean scent of autumn leaves and wood smoke. The unmarked black vehicle carrying Dion was just turning out of the neighborhood, its red and blue lights fading into the distance. The street was quiet, the wealthy neighbors securely locked inside their own homes, undoubtedly whispering about the absolute collapse of the people who used to live in the beautiful colonial house. I walked down the driveway, my head held high, my shoulders relaxed and light. I reached my car, unlocked the door, and slid into the leather driver's seat. I started the engine, feeling the familiar, powerful rumble beneath my hands. As I pulled away from the curb, I looked in the rearview mirror one last time, watching the dark outline of the sprawling fortress fade into the shadows. They had tried to take $50,000 to break my spirit. Instead, they had simply paid the absolute final price for my permanent, unquestionable freedom. The next 6 months played out like a perfectly directed film. I did not lift a single finger to intervene or offer a single dollar of assistance. I simply watched from a comfortable distance as the absolute consequences of their actions dismantled their lives piece by piece. The 30-day eviction notice I dropped on the Thanksgiving table was not a theatrical prop or a hollow threat. It was an ironclad legal mandate. Richard, with his bruised ego, desperately tried to fight it. He scraped together whatever cash he had left and hired a discount attorney to challenge my holding company in civil court. It was a pathetic display. My corporate legal team walked into the courtroom and completely crushed his defense in a single afternoon hearing. The judge looked at the signed lease agreement, looked at the bounced payment records, and ordered an immediate eviction. Exactly 30 days after the holiday dinner, a county sheriff arrived at the beautiful colonial estate. My parents were forced to pack their belongings into a rented moving truck while the wealthy neighbors watched from their front windows. There were no caterers or valet drivers this time. There was only the harsh reality of a padlock being placed on the heavy oak front door. Richard and Patricia were forced to move into a cramped two-bedroom apartment in a completely unremarkable complex, situated right next to a loud interstate highway. The walls were paper-thin. The carpet smelled faintly of old smoke and cheap cleaning products. There was no manicured lawn, and certainly no heated swimming pool. Patricia tried to cram her oversized antique furniture into the tiny living room, creating a claustrophobic maze of mahogany and faded velvet that served as a constant mocking reminder of the wealth she had lost. The social ghosting was absolute and brutal. Patricia attempted to maintain her aristocratic facade, pretending the move was a temporary downsizing measure while they looked for a new estate. She drove to the country club one Tuesday morning, expecting to have lunch with Cynthia and Aunt Helen. Instead, she was stopped at the front gate by security. The board of directors had formally revoked Richard's membership for non-payment and conduct detrimental to the club. When Patricia tried to call her wealthy friends, her calls went straight to voicemail. The neighborhood elite had witnessed the absolute destruction of my family on Thanksgiving, and they wanted absolutely nothing to do with a bankrupt man and a woman whose son-in-law was facing federal prison. Patricia spent her days sitting in her cramped apartment watching daytime television, completely isolated and entirely forgotten by the society she worshipped. Richard fared even worse. The man who used to hold court at the golf club boasting about his massive investments was now reduced to drinking cheap domestic beer on a tiny concrete balcony overlooking a crowded parking lot. He spent his evenings aggressively complaining about the heavy footsteps of the upstairs neighbors, but he had absolutely no power to do anything about it. He applied for several mid-level corporate consulting jobs, trying to leverage his old contacts, but his reputation was completely radioactive. No one wanted to hire a man whose financial incompetence was the punchline of every joke at the country club. He was forced to take a humiliating position managing a small regional branch of a logistics company, reporting to a man half his age just to keep the lights on in their miserable apartment. Allison's world crumbled even faster, and the fall was infinitely more spectacular. The federal indictment against Dion was officially unsealed 2 days after the Thanksgiving disaster. The authorities charged him with multiple counts of wire fraud, money laundering, and interstate gambling offenses. Facing 20 years in federal prison, the smooth-talking tech mogul completely folded. He took a plea deal, giving up his associates in exchange for a reduced sentence, leaving Allison to face the wreckage entirely alone. She filed for divorce immediately, desperately trying to play the victim and distance herself from his crimes. But a divorce decree could not manufacture money. Dion's assets were entirely seized by the federal government, leaving her with absolutely nothing. Without my holding company acting as her financial guarantor, Allison's aesthetic lifestyle boutique was legally repossessed. My property management team went in and completely liquidated her remaining inventory, selling her overpriced candles and cheap imported clothes for pennies on the dollar to cover her outstanding rent. At 32 years old, the golden child of the family woke up to a terrifying reality. She had no rich husband to float her lifestyle. She had no corporate backer to fund her vanity projects. She had no college degree because she had dropped out to become an influencer. And most importantly, she had absolutely no marketable skills. For the first time in her entire privileged life, Allison had to actually support herself. 2 months after the eviction, I received a discreet photograph from my private investigator. It showed Allison standing behind the counter of a massive corporate chain coffee shop. Her designer clothes had been replaced by a stiff green apron and a plastic name tag. She was waking up at 4 in the morning to steam milk, wipe down sticky counters, and operate a cash register for minimum wage. The sheer psychological humiliation of her new reality was evident in her exhausted posture. She had to smile and serve expensive lattes to the exact same wealthy suburban women she used to party with. She was no longer the glamorous entrepreneur. She was a service worker entirely invisible to the people who used to envy her. The golden child had finally been introduced to the real world, and the real world did not care about her aesthetic vibe. I learned through mutual acquaintances that Allison frequently broke down crying in the middle of her shifts, unable to handle the fast-paced stress of actual physical labor. Her store manager, a 22-year-old college student, regularly reprimanded her for checking her phone or messing up simple drink orders. She would call Patricia begging to move into the second bedroom of the cramped apartment, but Richard strictly forbade it. For the first time in his life, Richard could not afford to subsidize his favorite daughter. He bluntly told Allison she was on her own. The realization that her parents were completely powerless and could no longer rescue her broke whatever remained of her entitled spirit. She was trapped in a repetitive cycle of aching feet, smelling like roasted beans and stale vanilla syrup, and counting her minimum wage paychecks just to afford a tiny studio apartment she shared with two roommates. While they were drowning in the shallow end of the reality they created, I was experiencing an unprecedented professional and personal renaissance. Cutting the financial umbilical cord to my toxic family changed absolutely everything. For years, my corporate holding company had been secretly bleeding capital. I had been funneling massive amounts of money into Richard's bad bridge loans covering Patricia's exorbitant platinum card bills and absorbing the massive monthly losses from Allison's boutique. The moment those financial drains were permanently capped, my wealth did not just stabilize, it completely skyrocketed. Without the constant crushing anxiety of managing my family's manufactured crises, my mind was entirely clear. I poured all of my renewed energy directly into my public relations firm. We launched a massive, aggressive expansion campaign, and within a single financial quarter, my agency landed 3 major national accounts. We secured a global technology firm, a massive pharmaceutical brand, and a top-tier athletic wear company. My staff doubled in size. We leased the entire top floor of our downtown glass tower. The industry publications began featuring my name not as a rising star, but as an absolute powerhouse in the corporate crisis management sector. I was generating more revenue in a single month than Richard had made in his entire career. But the most profound change was not the massive numbers multiplying in my investment portfolios. It was the absolute unshakable peace that filled my daily life. There were no more late-night frantic phone calls demanding cash. There were no more guilt trips about how I worked too much or how I was an unnatural daughter. I bought a stunning new penthouse overlooking the city skyline entirely for myself. I decorated it exactly how I wanted, without ever worrying if my mother would criticize the color palette. I was finally living a life that belonged entirely to me. I had excised the tumor that was my family, and the relief of being healthy was intoxicating. My physical health even improved. The chronic stress headaches that had plagued me since my early 20s completely vanished. I was sleeping soundly through the night. I was no longer holding my breath, waiting for the next emotional manipulation. Every morning, I woke up, looked out at the city, and felt a deep, profound gratitude for the cold clarity that had allowed me to walk away. To celebrate the closing of our largest national account and to properly honor the 35th birthday that my family had so violently interrupted 6 months prior, I decided to treat myself to a proper vacation. I booked a first-class ticket to Greece, renting an exclusive private cliffside villa. I packed my designer luggage and left the cold Chicago winter behind, ready to celebrate my complete victory. The contrast was poetic. They had tried to steal $50,000 to secure their comfort, and in doing so, they handed me the keys to an absolute empire. The Aegean Sea stretched out before me, an endless expanse of brilliant sapphire blue that seemed to merge perfectly with the cloudless Mediterranean sky. I was sitting on the sun-drenched private balcony of a five-star cliffside resort in Santorini, Greece. The warm afternoon breeze carried the faint sweet scent of sea salt and blooming bougainvillea, rustling the sheer white canopies that draped over my private infinity pool. I held a glass of crisp, local white wine in my hand, listening to the distant soothing sound of the waves crashing against the ancient volcanic rocks far below. I was finally celebrating my 35th birthday. It was 6 months late, but it was the first time in my entire life that I was celebrating completely on my own terms. My actual birthday half a year ago had begun with a stolen $50,000 and ended in a completely silent car ride after I dismantled my family's financial infrastructure. At the time, I thought the pain of realizing my family only loved my bank account would eventually crush me. I assumed I would have to endure a long, agonizing grieving process for the parents and the sister I was leaving behind. But sitting here on this beautiful Greek island, surrounded by absolute luxury and profound peace, I realized something incredible. There was no grief. There was only an overwhelming, intoxicating sense of relief. The physical toll of carrying my toxic family had vanished completely. For my entire adult life, I had suffered from chronic tension, holding my breath, waiting for the next disaster I would be forced to pay for. I used to grind my teeth in my sleep. I used to wake up with my heart pounding, wondering what passive-aggressive insult my mother was going to hurl at me, or what new failed business venture my sister was going to demand I fund. Now my body felt light. My mind was sharp and entirely my own. I had spent 35 years being told I was a difficult, unlovable burden. But without their constant, heavy negativity dragging me down, I had soared higher than I ever thought possible. My public relations firm was thriving, my wealth was multiplying, and my spirit was entirely unbroken. I took a slow sip of my wine, letting the cool liquid soothe my throat. I watched a small white sailboat glide silently across the vast blue horizon. It was a perfect, uninterrupted moment of absolute serenity. And then the silence was briefly broken by a soft, mechanical vibration. My cell phone, which was resting face up on the smooth white marble patio table, lit up. I set my wine glass down and leaned forward, picking up the device. The screen displayed a new text message from an unsaved number. But the moment I read the first line, I knew exactly who it was from. Even without the financial backing, the sheer audacity of my mother remained completely intact. The message was a masterclass in emotional manipulation. "Claire, please," the text read. "I know you are still angry with us, but you have made your point. We are really struggling. The apartment is freezing and the electric company is threatening to shut off our power tomorrow morning. Your father's new job at the shipping company barely covers our rent and groceries. I am begging you. We just need a small loan, $200 just to keep the heat on. I am your mother, Claire. Please remember that we are your family." I sat back in my luxurious cushioned lounge chair, reading the words over again. I paid close attention to the physical reaction in my body. In the past, a message like this would have sent me into a complete tailspin of anxiety. My heart would have raced. The programmed guilt installed in my brain since childhood would have flared up, screaming at me that I was a terrible person for letting my parents suffer. I would have immediately logged into my banking application, transferred $500 just to be safe, and sent a long, apologetic text, making excuses for my own boundaries. I would have sacrificed my own peace to buy their temporary comfort. But as I sat on that balcony in Santorini, I felt absolutely nothing. There was no racing heartbeat. There was no hot flush of guilt. There was no desperate urge to fix their self-inflicted misery. I looked at the text message and saw it for exactly what it was. It was not a genuine plea for reconciliation. It was a test. Patricia was probing the perimeter of my boundaries, trying to see if the passage of time had softened my resolve. She wanted to see if the automatic teller machine could be plugged back in even for just $200. She still did not understand. She still believed that the biological title of mother entitled her to my hard-earned money. She thought the guilt of the word family would magically erase the decades of emotional abuse, the blatant theft, and the vicious smear campaign she had launched against me at Thanksgiving. I looked out at the brilliant blue ocean. I thought about Richard sitting in his cramped apartment, complaining about the electric bill. I thought about Dion sitting in a federal holding cell, waiting for his trial. I thought about Allison wiping down coffee counters for minimum wage. They had built their entire lives on a foundation of lies and entitlement. Gravity had simply done its job and pulled their fragile house of cards straight into the dirt. I was not responsible for catching them when they fell. I looked back down at the glowing screen of my phone. I did not type out a reply. I did not tell her where I was or how incredibly successful my life had become without her. She did not deserve access to my success, and she certainly did not deserve access to my attention. I tapped the screen, opening the contact options. I selected the delete conversation button, watching the pathetic manipulative text vanish into the digital void. Then I tapped the final, most powerful button on the screen. Block caller. The action was instantaneous and permanent. The invisible thread that had connected me to her desperation was completely severed. I set the phone face down on the marble table. I picked up my wineglass and leaned back, closing my eyes as the warm Greek sun washed over my face. The absolute silence returned, sweeter and more profound than ever before. The story of the scapegoat was officially over. The story of the empowered, successful, and fiercely independent woman had truly begun. They thought taking $50,000 would break me. They did not realize they were just finalizing the transaction to buy my absolute freedom. Have you ever had to financially cut off toxic family members? How did they react when the automatic teller machine finally shut down? Let me know in the comments below. Do not forget to like and subscribe to hear more stories of taking your power back.